manifesto, and it says that Nesta will be about talents, not buildings, which is a great way to say welcome to this lovely building. Innovation is all about pivoting, and we have pivoted. Nesta, for those of you who don't know us, we are an innovation foundation. We design, test, and scale solutions to big societal problems. We have three big missions. One is on sustainability, the other is on a fairer start, and the third is on healthy life. And we do everything from running experiments with frontline organisations, building ventures, and also shaping policy. The vague justification for having David over here was our project on UK 2040. So in the run-up to the next election, we're trying to think through what are the big choices facing the country and trying to get the debate focused more on the long term. What can we do now in the next 4 or 5 years to set us up for 2040? And it's in that context I wanted to talk to David. David doesn't really need much introduction other than he now runs some organisation called the International Rescue Committee, is that right? You've been there 10 years. It's now an organisation that works in 40 different countries, about £1.5 billion of aid, and helps some of the most crisis-affected people in the world. And as you know, David spent a career in politics before that, as Foreign Secretary, as Environment Secretary, setting up the Climate Change Act, and in a number of other ministerial roles. We will also talk about his earlier career, where he was head of the number 10 policy unit and worked with Tony Blair from 1994 onwards. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ravi. It's very, very nice to be here. The Nesta story actually Alistair Campbell deserves some credit for this, because 10 days before the general election, or I suppose 2 weeks before the general election, he said, God, this is getting boring. We've got to come up with something to ginger this up a bit. Come on, because John Major had set up a 6-week election campaign. And he said, whatever happened to that idea about the Millennium Lottery funds? And John Newbegin, I don't know if he's online, had done some work with Ben Evans on it. And he said, you better go and fill that hole. And so we came up with the idea that the £250 million endowment, I think then it somehow got to 350 million. But into the void of 10 days before the election campaign was the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, as it was christened at the time. And the idea was, look forward, don't just look back, invest in the future. And it's a real thrill that you have taken over. I didn't have in my mind's eye that you were going to be the CEO 25 years later, but it is pure joy that you have been able to take over. I'm dreading this next hour, because whenever I had to do events like this, I would always ask Ravi to give me some intelligent things to say before them, and now you're going to be posing the questions, so I can hardly ask you for the answers. But I think what you're doing now is fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to at least hearing your questions, if not my answers.
Well, luckily you've chosen the one Gurumurthy who isn't a professional TV interviewer, so it'll be
Your
fun.
sister's been on to me today saying, how did he get in the interview list? So,
I want to start with actually an article you wrote in The Guardian. I think it was a month ago. Can you remember it?
in the Observer, yep.
Observer, sorry. And it was saying that although foreign policy is never at the heart of any election campaign, it's delusional to think that the UK in the next 10, 20 years will not be massively shaped by that external global context. And I just wanted you to sort of set out what are the big things that we need to be keeping in mind in terms of that global context, and what are the implications for the UK?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because of 2040. The immediate thing is to go to demography and other things that are more or less certain about what Britain will be like in 15 years' time. But actually, the three things that I highlighted in the article center on this idea that we're living in a more flammable world. And the idea of a flammable world comes from the work that we're doing in Gaza, in Sudan, still in Syria. And I think there are three things going on that explain why this is why so much of the tinder around the world is going up in flames. The first is that interconnectedness is increasing risks. Health risks, climate risks, economic risks, even nuclear risks, economic risks. So it's a time of intensification of risk because of interconnectedness. Secondly, the post-American world that Fareed Zakaria wrote about in a book that he published 20 years ago, which was less about the decline of America and more about the rise of the rest, is actually coming to pass. I mean, America's share of GDP hasn't changed global GDP hasn't changed very much in the last 30 years, but Europe's down, Japan's down, the rest are up. And so Fareed wasn't saying America's going to be gone, but he's going to be saying we're going to be living, he said, a multipolar world. I call it a multi-aligned world, where state actors, non-state actors are carving out spheres of influence. It's much more transactional, it's much more fluid. Demography is a strength for countries like India and Indonesia. Money is a strength for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Global connections are a strength for countries like India. And I think that's increasing the pressure on countries like the UK. And then the third thing, which I don't want to sound like I'm just throwing it in as, well, everyone's got to mention technology, but I think, seismic nature of the technological revolution, not evolution, that's happening at the moment is really profound, I think. When I think about, I spoke to someone last night who's in business. Their world has been transformed by AI already. My world of humanitarian aid hasn't yet been, and the gap was just huge about what people do, how they spend their time, how they create value. And so my argument in this article was that we need to have a really hard-headed look at where we stand as a country, because those three global factors are going to significantly constrain our choices over the next 15 years and affect all of our futures. And so I think that's the global context, which isn't just a matter for foreign policy. It's everything from energy to migration to industry. It's almost every aspect of life.
You mentioned some of the alliances and relationships we have. If you take Europe as an example, what do you think is a sort of ambitious but realistic trajectory for our relationship with Europe? And in particular, do you see more appetite on the European side to engage with us, particularly given their concerns around defence and our potential role?
I don't see much appetite at the moment because they've got massive challenge to bandwidth. I mean, the extraordinary changes that have been engineered so far in European energy policy post the invasion of Ukraine is a massive drag. Asylum and immigration, migration, massive issue. How to counter nationalist populism is a consuming question on the continent. So I don't think a big part of their calculus is about the UK. However, as your question suggests, I think that on the security side and the foreign policy side, we've got a real offer that we can make. I also think on the industry R&D side, weapons procurement for Ukraine, there's quite a lot there. And I think we've got to be very careful as the UK. I made a speech about this last night. I think foreign and defence policy could be the proving ground of a different kind of relationship between the UK and the EU. It should be organised, it should be institutionalised, it should be systematised. But if we overplay our hand and say, we'll cooperate with you on security if you give us a sweetheart deal on economy, I don't think that will work. So I think we've got to be careful. But given that nearly 50% of our trade is still with the EU, if the EU is a declining part of the global economy for the next 15 years, that's going to make the uphill struggle that we've got even greater. And so I think it's in our interest that we don't just have a geopolitical EU, but a successful Eurozone. And we're not going to be part of it, but we can benefit from its success, and we can even contribute in some ways to its success, just as it can contribute to our success. I mean, in a way, the interesting thing about post-Ukraine and this whole debate about supply chains with China is that the world may be getting smaller, but the importance of our neighborhood is growing. And we're still a European country, and I think it's worth remembering that.
You touched earlier on migration as one global challenge that will affect the UK in the future. How do you get a policy that does what it needs to do in terms of welcoming migrants in, given our ageing society and our economics, also respects the rights of refugees, but doesn't play into the right? Because if you think back, New Labour days, there were lots of pretty tough policies on asylum, denying the right to work. I think Jack Straw did that in the first few years. What's the way of squaring the circle?
Well, first of all, I never argue the case for the dignity of refugees on economic grounds. I think if you do that, you end up in a very bad place. I think refugees and asylum seekers, you need to sort out a policy on them. But if you try and sell it on the grounds it'll help an economic problem, you get into trouble. My very strong view is the refugee and asylum question and the immigration or migration questions, you don't want them mixed up. And I learned this lesson in the run-up to 97 because there was Michael Howard left us a massive problem with unprocessed Kosovan asylum seekers, and the debate about asylum completely got in the way of the debate about migration and immigration. So point one, I think you have to try and keep them separate. Secondly, much easier said than done, but if it's not an orderly process, it'll be an unpopular process. And I don't accept the argument that there's so much migration it can't be orderly. The fact that in the US now, it takes, if someone crosses the border and registers for asylum, they'll get a court case in 6 or 7 years. I mean, that is just not a sustainable system. And in 2015-16, the EU wasn't even able to say who was coming in and who was not coming in. So I think, I'm running a humanitarian organization, that doesn't mean everyone can come in. It's got to be an orderly process for saying who meets the asylum criteria, who doesn't meet the asylum criteria, and they're global rules about that. And I think you have to defend them, but you have to have a process that manages it. Thirdly, I think that there's a real fair shares issue. I don't know enough about it, but I think part of the problem for continental Europe has been that people in Sweden and people in Germany and people in Greece and people in Italy think they are bearing a disproportionate share of those who are coming into Europe. And that's been true in the US, where Texas, California, Arizona, it was seen as a southern border question. And then you had all this thing of people being shipped to democratic states, so Texas, from Texas. And it's got to be, for them, it's got to be a national question. For us, it's got to be a European question. So I think there has to be some fair shares around it. That doesn't answer your migration question, where, I'm going to try and say this in the right way. If Japan decides that it wants to have a very restrictive migration policy, which it has, despite the fact that lots of economic commentators have said that's contributed to their economic crisis over the last 30 years, that's a legitimate societal decision because they don't have international obligations in respect of migration. They do have international obligations in respect of asylum and refugees. And so I think you've got to allow for national political debate about migration that does bring in the economic and social things. I suppose there's one other thing, which is speed of change seems to matter a lot to political acceptability. And not all the examples support the thesis that fast change is going to be unpopular. The German case is kind of an interesting counterexample in various ways. 1.5 million people arrived, they were processed fast. 2/3 of them learnt German within 3 years, I think. Most of the adults are working now. But I think speed of change is also part of the management, since you were asking about political management of it. Yeah.
I mean, but if you were in government right now and you were faced with a small boats crisis, there'd be a huge temptation, wouldn't there, to be incredibly tough in order to close the issue down and not get exploited by the opposition. And yet, from your position now at the IRC, you probably take a very different
what does closing it down mean? I mean, closing it, shouting about it doesn't close it down. Closing it down, I mean, there's a very interesting example. One of the things I'm saying is you want to go from irregular to regular. The US has offered 30,000 migration places a month to asylum seekers from Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. Blow me down, if you offer people a legal route, suddenly the number of people coming irregularly, quote unquote illegally, drops through the floor. So, I mean, literally down to less than 10% of the previous numbers from those countries because there's a legal route to hope. So if I'm saying to you, there's a legal route. It's a bit of a lottery. You've got to go onto you got to register at the beginning of the month, but you'll get your place in the queue. Or you can put your hands in your fate in the hands of a people smuggler who's going to take you across the Darien Gap from Colombia. It's then a proper choice. If you've got no choice about the legal route and your only choice is the people smuggler, you're going to have a much bigger problem.
Mm-hmm. Can I just come on to defence? Because that's the other big change actually in recent months even, where both parties have committed to getting up to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence. I was just showing David our tax calculator, Be the Chancellor, which we created with IFS, and it just shows how much actually that might cost over the course of the Parliament, and it's an extra £13 billion per year.
It must be more than that, by the way. I was thinking about this because the defence budget is 50 billion plus, and it's 2% of GDP, so that's 25 billion for each percent. So how can it be only...
It's at £42 billion at the moment, and it goes up to 53 billion, and then if you add on interest charges, it takes it up to an additional 13 billion.
So another 0.5% is another 12 or 13
We'll debate the numbers after that. I think it's a lot of money. I think it's 13 billion, and so do the IFS. But I mean, the point is that's a huge commitment just to make, and it seems like it's the only policy area where, rather than sort of saying what capabilities do we actually need, and what do we not need, and what shall we commission and decommission, and then sort of saying how much we should spend, you just sort of blithely make a massive commitment.
The journalists who are here, please don't write this up as Miliband writes slashing attack on all political leadership that exists at the moment. But my view on this is the following. And I've got to say this because I've got an article coming out in Oxford Review of Economic Policy about Britain in the world, and I wrote this before all these commitments were made. You could double the intelligence and diplomacy budget for the same amount as a 10% increase in the defense budget. And if you're thinking about contribution to global security, that, I think, there's a real argument about what you're going to get more value for, not least if you think about where the long history of how not all defense spending gets the best value for money. Mm-hmm. And so my view is that you have to think about your contribution to global security and British security in the round. And on Ukraine, our intelligence was right. A lot of people were doubting whether it was right. That's a good investment. That's a very important investment. And so I would say that it's really important to think about the range of ways in which we're going to contribute to our own security. There's upward pressure for more spending on security, clearly, and that's totally understandable about why people are committing to more quote-unquote defense spending. My point is the definition of defense spending needs to be more than just the MOD.
Mm-hmm. And across sort of some of the big long-term issues like defence, like an ageing society or net zero, it seems hard for any democracy at the moment to actually make these long-term difficult choices. There are some areas which are difficult policy, but these are ones where there's often a political will challenge. Are there any examples of democracies that you think are getting it right? What innovations do you think we need in the way we do our democratic processes to get them to think more long-term?
This is slightly unfair, but let me answer the question this way. You and I were in government in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in 2007, and the Prime Minister reshuffled in 2006, and the Prime Minister said, by the end of the summer, I want you to figure out how to get the environmental initiative away from the Tories. And he said that to me, not to you. You were a civil servant, so he wouldn't. I came and then said to you, out of government time, I said, look, I've got this commission from the Prime Minister as the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And we came up with the idea of the Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Committee, carbon budgets, and all the rest of it. And so I think that the way I would answer your question is to ask what was different about that time that made it possible to have the world's first carbon budget from 2006-7 to 2050, which is what we did. And I think if you look at the ingredients of that, they're not that remarkable. we had a prime minister who was determined to make long-term decisions. Now, you could say, well, he wasn't up for re-election, so it was okay for him, but I don't think that's right. Secondly, you had a political race that was to the top, if you like, rather than the bottom. Thirdly, you had an economic opportunity, because part of the argument was you can't save the planet just by decarbonizing the British economy, but you can help. We just published the Stern report, or we were just about to publish the Stern report, which said it'll cost more to live with climate change than to fight climate change. So there was an economic angle. Now, you also had someone in the Prime Minister who was able who was like an explainer-in-chief, an educator-in-chief. He could explain this. So I don't think it's impossible. And there's this quote from the Luxembourg Prime Minister: "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it." I don't think that's right, because he was essentially saying, we all know austerity is right, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we've imposed austerity. No, we don't all agree that austerity is right. So I think there's still a political argument there. I think that, put it this way, if you're only acting for the short term, you're not going to get re-elected. Then you're running around in circles. And so I still believe it may be different. I mean, I'm living in New York and very difficult politics. But actually, there's one other thing which, now that I think about it, Bill Clinton always says, better to be strong and wrong rather than weak but right. And actually, if you're just chasing the short term, you're going to look weak. If you're long term, you've got more chance of seeming strong. And I think the voters reward strength. So, see, I like the Keir Starmer's missions. I think they're really good. I think the fact he's saying, no, we're not going to fix everything in 5 years, I think that's a good thing. Where I think they're being misunderstood is that they're not missions for the government, they're missions for the country. And so the question about what's the machinery of government for, there are people from the civil service here, I think the question for you is not how do we deliver the missions? The question is, how do we organize government to mobilize the country to deliver the missions, which is a different problem set.
And how would you do that?
I'd ask the best of the civil service. I think that you have to open, the first thing is the successful ministers, in my experience, are those who open the shutters rather than close them. You've got to open up the policy-making process. Secondly, you've got to take the goals in the missions and make them real, develop a set of outcome indicators underneath them that will deliver on them. Thirdly, I think you've got to clarify, I mean, this is an old thing that we worked, I've been very lucky to have worked with Ravi both in DEFRA and in the Foreign Office and then at the IRC. RACI, and above all, responsibility and accountability. People misunderstand the thing about Nye Bevan and the bedpan dropping in Tredegar being heard in Whitehall. You can be responsible for something without being accountable for it, and clarifying who's accountable for what and who's responsible for what, I think, is really critical to it. And then I'm a great believer in timelines and stage gates and course correction as you go along. My learning from the last 10 years, we've grown an NGO from $450 million to $1.5 billion. We do 30% of all the impact evaluations in the humanitarian sector, even though we're 3% of the sector. The biggest regrets I've got are about things I delayed doing rather than things that I did too fast.
Can we go to back to sort of 97, New Labour? We started getting a bit nostalgic. Happy days. I mean, you did a lecture. So I do read your work still, David.
You didn't write this one, though.
I read a lecture. It was the Mile End lecture.
Yeah.
And you talk about what was the New Labour project, and you actually take some time to define the idea of a project, because I think it's quite distinct to how we think about politics today. Do you mind just expanding on what was the project?
It's a bit worrying to me that there are people here who were in primary school when I was working on this in the mid-1990s. But Tony Blair asked me to be the head of policy in 1994, after John Smith died, and he said, I just want you've got to get rid of all the crap. You've got to get bomb disposal, all the policies that have been losing us elections, you've got to get rid of all that. But then he said, every single policy that we're going to run on we didn't know when the election was, whenever the election is, every single policy has to go through two filters. Filter number one, does it offer a new political choice for the country? Not the old right, not the old left, not the new right. So there was a political lens. And the second question it has to answer is, does it offer a new policy direction for the country that is genuinely a change from what's been tried before? And we ended up with 176 policies in the 97 manifesto. 169 of them were delivered. The 7 that weren't were actually the 7 that didn't quite meet the 2 tests that he'd set. But they were, every single day he was on to me, is this a new policy direction for the country? Is it a new political choice for the country? And this idea of a political project is different. A government is different from an administration, because an administration is a management challenge. A government is a leadership challenge. And the idea of a political project is one which doesn't shirk from its values and a vision of a better society and what that means, but it also doesn't shirk from hard choices about not just how you get there in policy terms, but how you get there in political terms. And in this lecture you talked about, I said there's a narrative arc to politics, which goes from threat to villain to hope to protagonist to proof. Those are the 5 elements of a political arc. And we said in 97, the threat is of a declining Britain that costs us dear. We said that the villains weren't just the wrong people in power. The threat was an outdated and misguided view of the role of markets relative to society, relative to the state. We said the hope was of a different balance of opportunity, responsibility, and community, which were essentially the foundations of our view of markets and community and the role of government as leaders. The protagonist, we said, was not just a new bunch of ministers, but a different kind of government that changed the political order. And the proof point was, we've changed the Labour Party so we can change the country. And I think that sustained us really for, I mean, it would have sustained us for longer, but for Iraq, but we won the 3rd election off the back of having that political project. And I think in the hardest times, that is really important. And I think that the 5 missions could be cohered into a political project that has real dynamism. And what we felt in 97, by 97, was that we had a political project, and every political project has to be about winning elections, but we also had a national project. And I think that's where your 2040 thing, I think, becomes very important, really. David Miliband died just 2 weeks ago, and I learned quite a lot from him when I was the secretary of something called the Social Justice Commission from 92 to 94, which really reconceived how the welfare state should work. He was a member of that. And his political argument was that small L liberal Britain and small SD social democratic Britain had been electorally divided. But what we did in Social Justice Commission, he sort of said this to me, is you're actually you're joining the small L liberal, small SD social democratic elements, the liberal element being personal freedom in a market economy, the social democratic element being social justice through state action. You're joining those together in a policy domain of redefining the welfare state. And that's how Sure Start came out, that's how the minimum pension guarantee came out, that's how citizens' service came out, that's how the national minimum wage. I mean, remember, liberal Britain had been for the national minimum wage, and social democratic Britain, weirdly, the trade unions had always been against the national minimum wage because they wanted collective bargaining for large parts of the 20th century. It's a weird thing. So actually, a national minimum wage with a low pay commission was a very good example of how, and a low pay commission that had business representation, it had union representation, it was a good example of how you can square the circle, I think.
It's interesting when I think about when you talk about project is one, a really interesting diagnosis of how society was changing. So if I think back to Marxism today and how they defined the country and defined the limits of labourism, that was hugely interesting. Secondly, there was this sense that you have to think about the ideas and ideology that relate to those different constituencies and then align a policy prospectus with that diagnosis and with those and with that ideology. It was a thicker prospectus, and a lot of work had been done by people outside of government over many years. And it feels like we don't have that right now. In some ways, we may end up being in a situation where the next Labour government wins without as much ideology or as many ideas as perhaps were around before. I think the other interesting feature, though, is that the ideological debate is richer actually on the right of politics now than on the left. And perhaps that's possibly the winning prospectus for the Labour Party. They're not riven by these difficult ideological debates, whereas the Conservatives are.
Well, this is why I'm much better giving your answers in these things than in these occasions than thinking of my own answers. That was very thought-provoking. Look, I don't think it's quite true. I don't think it is true. If I think about, Nesta is not partisan, but Resolution Foundation doing extraordinarily good work. IPPR doing very, very interesting work. There's a fact base that I think is that organizations like the IFS, this idea of a violent confrontation with reality. The IFS has established itself as you're not entitled to your own opinions. You're entitled to your own opinions, you're not entitled to your own facts on fiscal policy. I think that's very important. Big contrast with the US, by the way. So the trouble with, if you're in public life, you write and say things that turn out not to be great. In that lecture, I said that if you read the German coalition agreement, although the Social Democratic manifesto for the German election and the Liberal manifesto for the German election and the Green manifesto for the German election on their own weren't very inspiring, when you put the three of them together, it was quite inspiring. Now, unfortunately, the coalition government in Germany has not been able to follow through on the red, green, yellow prospectus that it developed. But I think that there are plenty of ideas for people, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but if, like me, you care about a more equal society, if you care about a more sustainable world, I think there's loads of ideas out there, actually, and there's more resources to do more good than any time. So I don't. People who say, "Oh, well, I'm not that," if Labour wins, there's going to be a change. Brings optimism. Now, the optimism can get dashed, but I think there'll be I hope there is a sense. I think there will be a sense of, God, this is a moment to do stuff.
So I want to get into sort of how change actually happens. My predecessor here, Jeff Mulgan, used to often say that we overestimate what we can achieve in the short term, but underestimate what we can achieve in the long term. And if I think about things like even the Climate Change Act, when we actually drafted it in 2006, 2007, the target was to reduce emissions by 60%. And we're now already at 50%. And obviously got upgraded, or even the minimum wage you mentioned, where I don't think anybody would have imagined how that would have been taken by the Conservative government to reduce low pay on a sustained basis for the last 10 years. So I wonder, if you look forward, are there any issues where you think one could imagine making a big change over the next 10, 15 years?
So look, two things about that. One, it turns out vandalism is more attractive and effective than I would like. So the vandalism against Sure Start, 3,000 Sure Start centres closed, it's gone. there was some. I was involved with creating a national college of school leadership for head teachers and deputy heads.
Yeah.
Gone.
Particularly in this country, more than say.
Well, I don't know, but I think it's worth pausing and asking ourselves about that. I mean, Scottish Parliament, not subject to vandalism. Minimum wage, not subject. Climate Change Act, still going strong. But I am 20 years older, struck that, I mean, I made a speech before the 2005 election saying if Labour can win again, it can institutionalise and instantiate a different kind of political settlement that won't get rolled back. Turns out that was wrong. That was complacent. So that's the first thing to say. Now, can you think of changes that will last? I think I mean, you know much more about this than I do, but in the energy field, I mean, the changes won't get rolled back because just once you've electrified and decarbonised, you're in a whole new ballgame. So I think they won't be rolled back. I think, funny enough, you and I did work on city regions and metro mayors. That's not going back. We had this idea of double devolution in 2007 that Whitehall needs to devolve to cities because cities are real economic units. Cities have to devolve to neighbourhoods. So I think that's got strong potential. I think that, so machinery of government maybe lasts longer. Maybe it's in social policy that I'm most struck. Although minimum pension guarantee, which the Social Justice Commission helped conceive, Tony Atkinson was the professor of social policy and had done a huge amount of work on pensioner poverty. He helped create this idea because there was still a lot of argument. Do you just want to boost the basic state pension, or do you want to have a means-tested system? That's lasted. So I think if you went across look, if anyone could crack long-term care, that wouldn't get rolled back. And it's desperately needed. The question is whether you can curate the political and policy moment to make it happen.
And when you think about how you sort of drive change, whether that's in government or actually in your current organisation, what have you learned? What have you changed your mind on about how you make big change happen?
I think the old cliches are all true. You can never over-communicate internally and externally. You can never measure and course correct enough, and both of them are important. You've got to measure the right things, and you've got to course correct as you go along. You need unlikely allies. When we were working at the IRC 7 years ago, we'd never entered a competition to win $100 million. Yet we entered the first MacArthur Prize to win $100 million to solve a global problem, and we entered the competition with a proposal to tackle toxic stress among 3 to 8-year-olds who were victims of the Syrian civil war, and we went and won, and we beat 10,000 applicants for that. So there's no substitute for that. My learnings, which is slightly different, I've learned 3 things above all. One, the bias to action is really important. There's always 100 reasons not to do something, but the bias to action is really important. Better to try and fail than to still be studying the question 10 years later. And that's really important in politics because you never know enough. You've got to have a bias to action. The second learning is about risk-taking as a strategy. We have this innovation fund, and we boast that it's got a 40% failure rate, which of course in politics sounds ridiculous, but for our philanthropists who fund us, they want a higher failure rate as proof that you're doing audacious things. So strategic risk-taking. And then thirdly, I could still be better at this. Speaking to universal values, I think, is really, really important. If you don't appeal to the better angels of people's nature, if you don't speak to universal values, then you can't have a project only of the head. I mean, of all people, Henry Kissinger said, a foreign policy that is born in the minds of the few and carried in the hearts of none is doomed to fail. So you've got to speak to universal values.
Didn't expect you to be quoting Henry Kissinger.
I know, it's interesting that you said it.
I just want to ask you one last question before we go to the floor and get some questions, which is that there may be one or two people who might find themselves in a new government or walking through the doors of Number 10. If you think back to that time, what's the thing you know now that you'd wish you'd known then?
That it doesn't last forever. I mean, it was a remarkable time, because none of us, I mean, it was 18 years, so it was actually longer. There was literally no one who, I mean, the closest we had to anyone who'd been in government was that Jack Straw had been parliamentary private secretary to Barbara Castle in the 1976 government, I think. So we had literally nobody who had who knew what the inside of, I mean, Jonathan Powell had been a diplomat in Washington, and we walked in on May the 2nd, 1997, and Tony and Cherie walked in, Jonathan and Angie and Alistair and Sally Morgan and myself. And Robin Butler and the civil service met us as we went in. My memory is the first thing Tony had to do was not to do with signing a letter about when to fire nuclear weapons, which is one of the things that prime ministers have to do, but sort of there was, which flat would he have? But you're then, the clock's ticking. And I suppose that, and cabinet appointments start, I suppose the thing that let me confess to this. There's a view among some of my New Labour friends that we didn't do enough in the first term. I actually think it was a model first term, because it laid a foundation of good government. It built confidence that aligned expectations with reality. It had serious delivery, but we were proud but not satisfied. And it gave people the confidence to give us another majority of 176 instead of 179. And now, there's an alternative view, which is that you should always strike while the iron is hot. So I think some of my other, you might have other veterans who say we should have done much more quickly. And while it's tempting to say that, I actually don't buy that. I think that my biggest learning is it was right to do what we'd promised to do. And that the worst thing, when Tony said we were elected as New Labour, we'll govern as New Labour, the worst thing would have been to say, oh my God, we've got a big majority, let's try and rewrite the script. I think that would have been a real mistake.
David, thank you very much. Let's go to questions. Well, let's take sort of 3 in a row so we can get through as many as we can. Is there a microphone? Perhaps we can have 3 at the front here.
I need a piece of paper.
Can I have that?
Hello, my name is Vincent Burke. Can I ask Mr. Miliband a couple of questions? What does he think the settlement will be over Brexit if and when Labour are elected? I think Keir Starmer's already seems making overtures for EU nationals living in the UK to be able to vote, and if they were to vote in a referendum, I think the result would be quite different in a future referendum. And also, perhaps a rather cheeky question, if, as a former Prime Minister said a few years ago, if the ball became free from the scrum rather than scum, would he ever consider a return to politics?
Hello, I'm Sanj with Shelterbox Trust. David, you talked about the legacy of good achievements and the vandalism against it. And if you look at things like the Good Friday Agreement, that's a great lasting legacy, but it took bipartisan cooperation. So when we're looking at how much we have to spend, do we need to first look at how we spend, given things like the lack of a national care strategy, industrial strategy on defense procurement, which doesn't always add up to good use of money? And is there, do you think, a hope for bipartisan commissions or group so that there is cross-party agreement on these solutions in the next 5 years?
Alec Robson, Design Education Trust. Yesterday, Andy Haldane of the Royal Society of Arts gave a talk, his annual talk, and he was very much on the gloom and doom, but with optimism for the RSA about the future. One thing he made quite a strong case for is that the UK has never been more risk averse in its institutions, government, banking, industry, than it ever has been compared to others. And therefore optimism needs to get UK to take more risk in order to grow a better society. Just any comment on that?
So just rattle through them. Look, on Brexit, this is what I think about Keir Starmer. He does what he says. I mean, he takes seriously and literally what he says he wants to do in government. So he's not going to have a referendum on reversing Brexit. He said that. But he does want to make sure that we have effective relations with the European Union. So I think take seriously what he says. I think that he said we're not joining the customs union. We're not going to join the customs union. Does that mean there's nothing else that can be done to foster better economic, industrial, foreign policy relations with the EU? No, it can be. And Europeans, as I said, we've still got nearly 50% of our trade with the rest of Europe, and we face if we're not careful, the Chinese electric car industry is going to gobble up the whole of the European car industry. There's not going to be the European cars will be actually Chinese cars made in Europe if current trends accelerate. So there's a whole set of issues that are there, and I think he'll work within the tram lines that he's set. I'm not going to get into anything to do with scrums or balls or any of that. Sanj is another great former colleague from the IRC. We're a CEO factory. I'd say two things. Economic necessity, fiscal necessity means we've got to be obsessive about how well we spend, how well public money is spent. We've got to be obsessive about finding ways of generating investment that don't come off the balance sheet. So the whole, for example, the contract for difference thing, did you invent that in which department was it?
DEC.
In DEC. All sorts of instruments like that, quasi-public-private instruments are going to have to be necessary. But we've got to be obsessive about how well we spend and whether we're spending for activities that are going to generate. I also think this idea of the missions for the country mobilizing activity from outside government is really important on that. Second thing, can it be bipartisan? Sometimes when parties lose big, they go crazy. And I don't know what the Tories are going to. If the Tories were to lose the election, I don't know whether they're going to be in the mode of behaving like an alternative government. Sometimes it takes time to get into the mode of behaving like an alternative government. So what's the big learning? Focus on locus of control. Focus on what you can control, not what you can't control. And so certainly whoever's in government is going to have to be obsessive about how well they spend. On the risk aversion, etc., I mean, don't get into Brexit as a risk that was a stupid one to take. Let's not go there. But here's my learning about optimism. I guess I used to think hope drives action. What I now think is action drives hope. That's where I got this bias to action. I mean, when we were confronted with the horror of October the 7th, and then almost immediately afterwards, enormous casualties in Gaza, it's the action that we've taken, 6 emergency teams working in Gaza, that gives hope. Saying to people, let's hope for something better and then take action, that's not going to do anything. It's actually having 6 emergency teams working in Gaza that gives people any shred of hope, even those who've lost loved ones, whether on October the 7th in Israel or subsequently in Gaza. So I've become a great believer that if you just sit there, you're going to end up worrying. So do something. there's a good guy who, if you get depressed about American politics and you think that Trump is going to win, there's a guy called Simon Rosenberg who has a daily newsletter called Hopium Chronicles, and he always says, worry less, do more. And I think that is a good injunction beyond American politics.
Okay, let's take another three. Okay, lady back there, Jennifer there, and then gentleman there.
Elise Larkin at the Rockefeller Foundation. Obviously, if the kind of energy demands in the developing world are met by fossil rather than renewable sources in the next 10, 20 years, we're all toast. So we need this huge amount of climate finance, but also the kind of social contract around ODA and, you know, the willingness of populations across Europe and the US to spend taxpayers' money on aid is kind of diminishing across the board. So I just wondered, like, what your thoughts are on that. What do you think possible solutions are?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jennifer.
Oh yeah, Jennifer Dixon from, is this working? No. Hello? Oh yeah. Jennifer Dixon from the Health Foundation. 2 questions on health. The NHS, facing fierce headwinds now, facing even more fierce headwinds in 2040. In 1997, there was a political project, to 2000, which was the leftover, I think, from the Thatcherite, Reaganite market forces, used to try to ginger up the NHS to improve and reform. That seems to have blown out as a political project a few years ago. What do you see could be the lodestar? Are we in that domain now, or are we just going to be facing pragmatism, fixing some of the problems directly ahead? So that's question 1. And question 2, if you look in the country where health is the worst on most measures, it's in the northeast. And in the northeast, and productivity, economy, etc., also in the doldrums up there. If money is thin because of the fiscal debt, and there is a bit of devo, but that might not be enough. If we're not going to spread the jam up as far as the northeast, because we're focusing on second cities, as the Resolution Foundation was suggesting, what hope is there for places up there, particularly as health is so linked to the economy? How could we just not write off a couple of generations until the economy kicks in up there? What do you suggest? Thank you.
Then gentleman at the front. Yep.
Hello, George Ryan from Public First. You spoke about institutional vandalism and new parties coming in and not necessarily ripping up old policies for the sake of it. What are some policies from the past 14 years that you think Labour ought to continue with?
Great questions, thank you.
Very good questions, far too difficult for me. Ellie, your question, it ended with the ODA, so let me think about that. I mean, when I was Environment Secretary, adaptation was very much the poor cousin of mitigation. It was almost like if you talked about adaptation, you were giving up on mitigation. And now we're in a situation where we failed on mitigation, so we need to catch up on, we need to do more mitigation faster, as you were saying, we need to do more adaptation, and we need to do loss and damage. I'll give you a very short answer to this. It's not an investable proposition to say spend 0.7%, full stop, end of story. It is an investable proposition to say we need to do the following things, and here's the investment that we need to put behind them. And I think that as someone who strongly supports the 0.7 target, going around chanting that isn't the way to get it. And I think that climate security is an important part of the argument. So is something like malnutrition, which is related to, did you say you're a Rockefeller Foundation? I didn't know they had that's good that they've got a London branch.
It's just me.
Oh, I see. I was going to apply for a grant from you. But we're doing some work with Raj Shah, the president of Rockefeller, on the malnutrition climate nexus. And I had a meeting today actually with WRI. We're trying to do some work with them about climate adaptation. I think it's all about investable interventions. The future of ODA is all about investable interventions, A, and B, it's all about the multilateral system, the World Bank. Because if you go to a World Bank office in South Sudan, their agenda is basically the humanitarian agenda, is real interface. I'll answer the third question, and then I'll probably not do a good job of answering the second question. But the third question, just to give you an example of a policy that we should keep. I saw David Cameron today, and I said, there was a prime minister who had a policy of 50% of ODA should go to fragile and conflict states. And that was him. So that would be a good thing to keep. If you want to target extreme poverty, you need to target fragile and conflict states. You're scratching, I'm scratching my head to think of many other successes. I'm afraid in the deficit column, I don't agree that the 2000-2001 health reforms were the same as what went before or the same as what happened afterwards. I was still in Parliament in 2012. I said that the Lansley reforms were vandalism. And I think that's been proved right, I'm afraid. And the North East is close to my heart. We still go to South Shields for holidays and feel very strongly about it. I don't think it's right that the Resolution Foundation said there are no second cities in the North East. I mean, Newcastle and Sunderland would both say that they are part of the vision of a renewed economic dynamism, but it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the model of the big inward investment a la Nissan in the 1980s. It's going to have to be a different model of growth. It's got big implications for small towns like South Shields. There's a longer story about the attempts to connect places like South Shields to the broader economy. On health, it's interesting to me that before 97 we did a lot more effective work on education than we did in health, and it took till the second term for us to really make progress on the education, on the health front. I do think what Wes Streeting is talking about in terms of prevention is very strong. I know that TBI are seen as being over indexed towards technological revolution, but I honestly think that that is a big part of how we're going to access healthcare and diagnose earlier. And I think that's a critical part of this. I don't see how we'll ever get the space for the social care changes we make unless we're able to get ahead of the curve on the health challenges that are ahead, and that means a massive diagnostic effort earlier in the game. I mean, if you diagnose cancer at stage 1, it's a totally different game than diagnosing at stage 3, and I think that's where that's the pivot around all of this.
Thank you. A few more questions. Okay, gentleman there, and then Isabel.
Hi, David. A lot of senior people in Labour these days seem to think that you'd make a very good US ambassador. So do you agree with them? And also, what advice would you have for a Labour Prime Minister to deal with a newly reinstalled President Trump?
Well, I don't know if there'll be a newly installed President Trump, but it's obviously a possibility. It's almost a coin flip, really, as to what's going to happen. Although I would say that there's quite a lot of ex-President Trump is ahead in the polls. It's not actually, it bears a closer scrutiny. And I would, as a sort of, if I was looking at this as a political practitioner, whose cards would you prefer to have? I think President Biden his side of the campaign has more cards to play. But as we found when President Obama came over for the Brexit vote, you've got to let countries make their own decisions. So all you can do is sit there and wait, cross your fingers probably, and deal with, I think David Lammy's in Washington at the moment. He's doing exactly the right thing in talking to everyone. That's all you can do, really.
Thanks. Last two questions. So,
I was meant to wait. Sorry,
gentleman there, and then I think, yeah, it's far end it.
Will Snell, Fairness Foundation. Should the next government do more to tax wealth?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, go for it at the end. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on something you said, David, about you described Tony Blair as the educator-in-chief. And really my question is how important you see that is to a project. It's, I guess, a reflection on not just the Labour Party, but I think sort of centre-left parties everywhere. They see their roles as reflecting majorities rather than constructing them. And if you're looking for politicians who are getting people to see their interests and identities differently, you're looking at populist politicians. And so I want to hear sort of how the world's changed in the 20 years since you were there and Blair was there, as to how important that might be for the future of the left and the New Left project.
Okay, great.
That's
And then,
really interesting.
Isabel, final question, and we'll leave it there.
This is a question from online, and it's about delivery in government. How should a next government think about delivery at the scale needed for sort of infrastructure works on net zero to actually get it done at the timescale that we need?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Just give the mic to the guy at the back. I lost what you said about populists are doing. Just say that again.
I just said that populist politicians are quite effective at getting people to see their interests, their own interests and identities differently, which is to say it's not that large swathes of Europeans became more xenophobic in the past 20 years. That's too quick for public opinion to change. It's been mobilized as a social identity by a gifted politician.
Yeah, I'm not sure I go along with that last bit, because the danger of that is it's sort of saying migration is not an issue. So that last bit, because there was a book written, What's the Matter with Kansas, which sort of said, why do people keep on voting Republican when they shouldn't? And that's not a very good argument. I don't think. And they shouldn't was a kind of, I don't know, I guess a class politics thing, and it didn't appeal to me, or I don't think it would work. I think that the explainer-in-chief, the educator-in-chief thing, I think is important, and a really underestimated importance of politics, really. Neil Kinnock once said to me, every great speech must be an instruction as well as an inspiration. And I think that if you go back to any of Tony's press conferences, or Obama actually was very good at this, Clinton was good at it, they actually explained what the choice was before they said what the choice was that they'd made. And I think that is really important. Now, if we enter a world where you're entitled to your own facts, not your own opinions, it's very hard to sustain that. If we're in a world where you can only concentrate for 12 minutes or 280 characters, it's very hard to do that. But sustaining the space for explaining the choice and then what the choice is, people often say if you're explaining, you're losing. I don't buy that, actually. If you're explaining, you might be on the route to winning. You might be on the route to persuading people. If you're making excuses, then you're losing. But I think if you're explaining, that's part of your job. And maybe when I said earlier, you can never over-communicate enough. I think that's what we learned in COVID, what we learned in the George Floyd moment, what we learned in some ways through Gaza, is that how and what you communicate needs to be chosen. You need better communication, not just more communication. There's a communication for a group of 120 is different for a group of 12, is different from a group of 1, is different from a group of 12,000. And I think curating the space for the right kind of better communication is really, really important. Just on the last question, I mean, that needs a whole session of its own, but we know what doesn't work. Trying to do it all yourself is not a route to delivery at scale. Micromanagement doesn't deliver at scale. What delivers at scale is incentives. What delivers at scale is the snowball effect. What delivers at scale is the North Star, so that everyone can align behind the vision, even if they're not directly responsible for it. What also is vital to delivery at scale is not turning around when you hit bumps in the road. Because I think often big changes that could deliver, they run into trouble and then there's a stall and then even a turnaround. Follow through when you hit the bump, I think, is the the most important thing. I got reshuffled out of the Department for Education in December 2004, and Mike Tomlinson was about to deliver his report on the reform of 14 to 19 education. Get rid of GCSEs, have a unified high school leaving diploma for academic and vocational subjects. And I'd first written about it in 1992, and I said to Tony, okay, if you're going to I was reshuffled to the Cabinet Office to work on the 2005 manifesto. I said, I can't stop you reshuffling me, but for God's sake, make sure that this Tomlinson report gets put through. And it was, yeah. And 15 years later, 20 years later, the same problem still exists. And what is it? 1/3 of the last 2 years of years 10 and 11 are spent either doing exams or revising exams that were originally conceived as school-leaving exams at the age of 16. It makes no sense at all. And so we hit a bump in the road, and I think see it through is really important.
Thank you very much, David. Good advice for all of us, particularly at Nesta, on our missions. I want to thank you, David, for joining us. Also want to thank you all for joining today. Two things to flag up. One, we've got some drinks after this, and they're on the 6th floor, so do come up. It's a better view there. And secondly, UK 2040 options. We're doing a series of reports over the next few months, synthesising the evidence and the ideas on each of the main challenges facing the country, and we'll be hosting a bigger conference in September, pulling that all together. In the meantime, do come to drinks and badger Alex, who's somewhere here at the back, who's leading the team brilliantly on this work. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to David. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right,